Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, has died. He was 95 years old. Those who know my work as a theologian also know that even though I never met this great thinker, I regard him as a theological model and mentor. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli for Catholic Studies Academy, and in this video, I'd like to tell you why. When I first began to develop a real religious consciousness, I felt inspired to pick up the Gospel of John and just read it through from beginning to end, trying hard to pay attention to every word. I was in high school at the time, and I did it. I really loved what I was reading. I let it sink in. But I realize now in retrospect that I didn't understand it very well. In fact, I really wouldn't understand it thoroughly for a long time to come. Then, as an undergraduate, I began studying philosophy and theology, and I came to understand that the Logos, the Word that was with God in the beginning and through whom all things were made, and who took on flesh and became a human being, was the very account of reality the philosophers had been groping at with varying degrees of success, and that now that search could come to an end because it revealed itself to us and came and spoke to us face to face. There was still a lot more, though, in John's Gospel, and the full significance of some of it would continue to escape me for some time. Now, Ratzinger had said once that Pope John Paul II had resolved to ask him to serve as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith because he'd been deeply impressed by Ratzinger's book, Introduction to Christianity. Interestingly, I'd first picked that book up as a freshman in college, if I'm not mistaken, and I have to say, I wasn't ready for it at the time. I like the systematic approach I found in St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. There were clearly formulated questions and answers, complete with rebuttals of the arguments other people might make against those answers. Step by step, question by question, he constructed a tightly woven fabric of seemingly necessary connections, causes, and effects. Given where I was then in my own intellectual formation, that approach gave me what I needed to make sense out of the world. But that wasn't what Ratzinger was doing. It was really only much later, through an interplay of life experience, grace, and further learning, that I arrived at a point at which I could once again open that book and encounter it on its own terms. And it completely changed my life when I did. It gave me a whole new vantage point from which to encounter and to speak about the world and what it means to believe in God and to be a Christian. So, how did it do that? Well, I think a lot of young Christian philosophers and theologians will probably understand what I'm about to say, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if a lot of other people just don't relate to it at all. People with a certain intellectual disposition often embrace faith primarily as a metaphysic, as a system of thought about reality. And in that system, God represents a foundational idea, a sort of necessary postulate. The idea of God as first cause and prime mover is what makes that system of thought work. And that system of thought, in turn, makes it possible for us to see the world itself as a rational place. But very often, we find it really hard to take the life of faith beyond the system. We'd profess the Apostles' Creed with firm conviction. We'd know all the right things to say about the sacraments and what they're for, and we'd believe what we were saying, and we might even persuade others that we were right. We'd make life choices and personal sacrifices from this foundation, and maybe even die for what we profess to be true. But in the end, we might still find ourselves living from and dying for a metaphysical account of the world rather than a relationship of love into which we'd been taken up and given to ourselves in the process, with only one truly rational option before us, namely to give ourselves back to the prime lover. Reading Introduction to Christianity changed my life because it changed the way I approached my faith. My encounter with that book, with the real mind of Joseph Ratzinger, broke the brain-heart barrier behind which my experience of faith had been constrained. I certainly didn't stop caring about metaphysics, but no longer was my faith primarily a metaphysical system of thought. No longer did I just believe that God existed and rest my confidence about the rationality of the world in the idea of God. The seed of my faith, planted in my soul at the time of my baptism, had finally sprouted, and I found myself in a personal encounter with God. I found myself genuinely believing God, trusting him in his self-disclosure to humanity, and thus seeing the world as an expression of that self-revelation, as an exitus and reditus of love, a movement out from and back to self-giving love. I've read Introduction to Christianity many times over since then, and I've become thoroughly immersed in Joseph Ratzinger's whole body of work. But recalling the beginning of my journey, coming to understand Joseph Ratzinger brought with it a new encounter with the Gospel of John. I finally really knew what it was saying. Indeed, in the end, this fact alone has an awful lot to do with my personal intellectual affinity for Joseph Ratzinger. He lived in the Gospel of John and in the other Johannine texts of the New Testament. And that's where I live too as a theologian, as any one of my students can probably attest. Ratzinger's first encyclical as Pope Benedict XVI was entitled Deus Caritas Est, a line taken from the Latin Vulgate translation of the first letter of John, in which John encapsulates the whole content articulated in the paradoxical Hebrew expression Yahweh Elohim. John tells us that God is love, and to be precise, the love of being for, being with, belonging to. This love is the very foundation of all being, the first and highest truth from which all else comes, and which provides the ultimate account of the cosmos. And thus inseparable from it is the logos for which every rational person seeks to find the meaning, purpose, and value of his life and of the world. And that logos is totally beyond the reach of finite being because it's absolute and infinitely expansive. But it's not just a metaphysical principle, cold and disinterested, thinking only of itself if it thinks at all. No, the very logic of God, the first and truest thing of all, the logos we seek but can never attain under our own power, is love. Its act of being is God's act of being, the God whose being is his own eternal love. And it's a love that seeks us first. We're created in and by and through this love, so we can be sought in and by and through him, and found by him, and returned in him to the Father's heart to share in God's own life. I could talk for hours about the Gospel of John and about the mind of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. But if you want to understand Joseph Ratzinger's theology in a nutshell, this is the key. As he put it himself, God created the universe in order to be able to become a human being and pour out his love upon us, and to invite us to love him in return. From this foundational affirmation, the whole positive content of the gospel comes to light for Ratzinger, and a complete theology can be developed, one in which what God is and who God is aren't two separate questions, but the same one. A theology in which what Christ is and what he comes to do aren't two separate questions either, but the same one. It's a theology in which Christ is the very center of history and the key to understanding what it really means above all else to be a human being. For Ratzinger, what we say about Christ, that he's the Logos incarnate, the Son of God and true God himself become a human being, isn't just a statement about him. It's a statement about the very structure of the cosmos. The recognition of a new cosmological and anthropological state of affairs. A change, in other words, in the very fabric of time and space and matter, and in what it's possible for us to be and to do and to become. As a theologian, Ratzinger never went much for hyper-specialization. He dealt as much as possible with the big picture, the whole of things. Though his expertise seemed to know no bounds, he was nonetheless a generalist, and that by choice. Now, of course, from here we can also come to understand with greater clarity two other distinctive characteristics of Ratzinger's mind. The first of them, clearly visible throughout the whole of his theological and ecclesiastical career, was his emphasis on continuity with tradition. He did believe that insight could be deepened and that much in the Church is subject to change in various ways. He rejected the view that the only way to the true faith is to recover the Church as it was in the time of the apostles and never to accept any alteration to it. He understood that development is a part of the life of the Church because the Church is a living organism, the body of Christ, the God of the living, not of the dead. But he was also persuaded that the Church's constant teaching and tradition, the Church's life of liturgy and prayer, popular piety and devotion, and the preaching and teaching of the fathers and doctors of the Church together carried forward and safeguarded the core of God's self-disclosure to humanity and access to its content, not only as an idea, but as a fact of being. And that's important because what Christianity fundamentally means just doesn't leave any room for anything more than it already gives. To paraphrase Simon Peter's words to Jesus after the Bread of Life discourse in the Gospel of John, where else is there to go? What further course remains to be charted? What possible destination lies beyond the horizon of the infinite to which humanity might be carried by the hand and heart of God? In the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, we confess that of his kingdom there shall be no end, which can just as easily be expressed by saying that there's no further purpose in reality than the perfect establishment of his kingdom. We can change the way we talk about it, but we can't exchange it for something new. There is nothing newer than the new creation itself, in which all else is made new. There's nothing more to hope for than sharing in God's own inner life, in a flesh and blood union with the incarnate Logos. There's no greater thing for us to become. So we'd have to reject any purported development, so-called, of Christianity that in any way either diminishes this hope, turning back from it to all the partial truths of merely natural religion and unaided human reason, leading us away from the fountain of living water to dry up in the desert as so many pillars of salt, or else which dares to suggest that not even God can satisfy us as he is, that our fulfillment requires God himself to change. The second characteristic we can see in Ratzinger's thought, which becomes visible from the vantage point of his core understanding of what Christianity fundamentally means, is his remarkable capacity to identify the point at issue in any controversy. As if a diagnostician, he was able to cut through the externals, viewing them as symptoms of a deeper cause. Both heresies and sound theologies have their etiologies, and Ratzinger could always identify what they were. That quality helped him to become a great theologian, and any theologian who ever aspires even to be competent should at least attempt to develop some approximation of that power. But even beyond what it did for him as a theologian, it made him truly great, in my view, as a prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and eventually as the universal pastor and teacher of all the faithful. Even in the midst of deep-seated controversies, Ratzinger was able to find points of agreement and to identify the enduring dogmatic significance between the lines of seemingly intractable disputes. There are such disputes within the Catholic tradition, and they don't always end in schism. It's people like Ratzinger who help us to find a way to a resolution, if there is one to be found, cutting through the particulars to get to the heart of the matter, that we can see the forest through the trees and not mistake a paradox for a contradiction. But it was also this same ability that enabled him to draw lines in the sand where necessary, identifying true contradictions and irreconcilable differences when they did arise. In those moments, he was able to express them with a clarity and precision truly deserving a description of magisterial. There's so much more I could say. I couldn't possibly begin to express in so short a space as this what I owe personally to Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI. But maybe from what I've said, you can get an idea. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything you've taught me and shown me, and for helping me to become a better Christian and the theologian I am today. May God grant you rest and peace. Amen.